Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Betty Duke. I'm the Norman and Florence Brody Forum Professor here at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Brody Forum of this academic year. Florence Brody was an alumna of the University of Maryland, and Norman said he was an alum by marriage. They believed in the power of education to change the world through ideas and leadership. And as such, they endowed a policy forum to encourage in-depth discussion of important ideas. Their work today is carried on by their son, Bill, and his wife, Susan, and a stepdaughter, Deirdre Lipsicus. Over the years, we've had a lot of wonderful speakers and people who are major thought leaders. It's my pleasure today to introduce two men who really fit that description to a T. First, I'm going to introduce our Dean of the School of Public Policy, Bob Orr, who's going to facilitate the discussion today. Dean Orr has been the dean here for 7 years, during which he's led the expansion of our graduate school to include undergraduates, graduate students at the master's level and PhD, and an executive program that's expanding. Prior to coming to us, he was the assistant to the Secretary General for Strategic Planning at the UN. He was, prior to that, executive director at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. And he started out here a long time ago in the Council for Foreign Relations. It's our pleasure to have Dean Orr with us today. Our guest is Andrew Aydin, the co-author with Congressman John Lewis of the award-winning best-selling series, March, a graphic memoir. The series is the story of the civil rights movement which John Lewis lived. The books in that series have won an incredible number of awards, including a National Book Award. That was the first ever awarded to a congressman and the first ever awarded to a book based on a comic book graphic approach to storytelling. The first book of a new series called Run brings the story further up into John Lewis's life and brings the issues up to our time. And it has been the subject of glowing reviews. Andrew, I know him as Andy. Andy comes to us after serving with Congressman Lewis for 13 years as a key staffer, not only in his office, but also helped with his campaigns. I first met Andy when he was a student of mine in a class that was taught by my husband and me to help master's students develop their ideas into solid proposals for a master's thesis. Andy announced on our first day of class that he wanted to do his master's thesis on a comic book. And so Dick and I said, sure, let's go for it. And it was a very special comic book. It was a comic book that inspired Congressman Lewis, and it carried a message of voting rights aimed at changing the world. Dick and I had the pleasure of helping Andy craft that thesis proposal, which we then navigated through the academic approval process. Andy and his mentor developed that proposal into a successful thesis, and Andy was awarded a master's degree from Georgetown University. Prior to that, Andy attended Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and Lovett School in his native Atlanta. Andy and Bob will have some time to dialogue today, after which Patrick Kelly, our Brody scholar who chairs our student board, will host a question and answer session with Andy, and they've already discovered they have a lot in common. We welcome your questions. If you'll put them in chat, then Patrick and Andy will have an opportunity to discuss them there. It's now my time, my pleasure, to welcome a former student, a true practitioner scholar of the public policy art, and our own Dean Bob Orr, for a discussion. Bob and Andy, it's all yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Betty. You are not just an amazing member of our faculty, but you have just done wonderful things with the Brody Forum, and bringing people like Andy here to join us is just the latest of your accomplishments. Thank you so very
Thank you.
much. So, Andy, it's my pleasure. I'm going to call you Andy because Professor Duke called you Andy. So, anything she says, that's my marching orders. So, if you don't mind, I'm gonna treat you like my oldest friend, Andy. Um, Andy, I think before we dive into policy and all kinds of big issues, I wanted to just start with a simple question about what was it like to work with Congressman John Lewis and in different capacities. We all know him as a civil rights icon. We know him as a very prolific legislator and a leader, but he was a man, a real live flesh and blood human being. But you worked with him for a number of years. Can you just talk a little bit about working with someone who's a little bit larger than life?
John Lewis was so playful. That's the thing I always think about. It in many ways is the way he survived, right? He would go to we get arrested, or he would give a big speech, and he would show this courage, and then he would come back and he'd throw jelly beans at us. And these things that I don't think we often see from leaders like him were so important to our relationship, because you're in these trenches, you're working these unbelievable hours, you've got this pressure on you. I mean, I can remember so many times when the congressman would say something or do something, and the phones in the office would just be ringing off the hook, emails, people literally waiting outside the door to catch him. And he would always have this center to him that was calm and playful and kind. And when you worked with him in those capacities, it really helped you find the right answer in the most difficult of circumstances, because he was able to block out so much of the noise that was thrown his way. And I was thinking about this just the other day, when we would get into a difficult situation, he would say, don't worry, it's all going to work out. This too shall pass. And he just had that center to him that gave him a calm and peacefulness that allowed him to thrive in incredibly difficult circumstances.
It's powerful. The combination of playfulness and calm and peacefulness, that really sounds like part of the magic Lewis formula. So you're a communications guy, and we all know communications are important. We know it's important in politics. We know it's important in policy. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of communications in mobilizing the public, in moving people, in moving the public. You are closely affiliated, as I understand it, to the term good trouble, for which Congressman Lewis was well known. And some of us have used the term, we've impinged upon the copyright, shall we say, to talk about getting into some good trouble. So can you say a little bit about the role of communications and why you went into it, and how you see it relating to politics, policy, and moving people?
Congressman Lewis used to say, you have to create the climate and the environment for change. And that was what we tried to do in his office when we tried to address different topics. I mean, I think communications itself it's all about storytelling. And that's so much of what politics is, right? A good legislator comes from their district, and they come to Washington and they tell the story of the people they represent. And for the congressman, we faced a tough challenge. I mean, when you think about it in the context of when I first started with him, it was 2007. And Congressman Lewis had just endorsed Secretary Clinton for president. And the blowback was substantial. And it really forced this question in our world about how do you tell John Lewis's story? Because we kept hearing over and over again that people didn't know what he had done. Young people didn't know who he was. I think an easy way to look at it is that the John Lewis we celebrate today was not the John Lewis of that era. He was struggling in many ways in that primary, which is largely where I got my start with the congressman, and in a communications sense, really define those battle lines. It's where the idea for the comic book came from. It's where, when you talk about Good Trouble, it was, well, let me just make it personal. I'll never forget on that campaign, the congressman said to me, "I'm worth more dead than alive." And I remember looking at this man who I'd admired, because I grew up in his district. He'd been my congressman since I was 3 years old. And I remember thinking, like, that is wrong. Like, he deserves better than that. And so it was in that capacity that I sort of piecemeal cobbled together, figured out a strategy that was two-pronged. I got him online, right? This was 2008. I was convincing everybody that, we're going to have to deal with social media. That's got to be a thing, right? Like there was no digital director back then. And so I basically created my own job for him at that point, because I'd started in his office answering his mail, and he liked me writing for him. I mean, that was it, right? I got his voice, and he liked the letters, and then it sort of went from there. And we got, we used the internet as a way to dramatize what his contributions were, right? We were so good at doing these historic tweets and being innovative in that way. Live tweeting the 50th anniversary of Selma, so that it dramatized. The congressman said, you got to dramatize the conflict, right? Because I think also John Lewis himself, when we talk about communications, he was a storyteller first and foremost. He was an activist. He had courage, but in the last 30, 40 years of his life, his job was to bear witness, and that's what he would say. And so we'd use these tools, we'd use the internet to dramatize that. And then in that capacity, we created a hashtag, and it was Good Trouble, because the congressman would always say, my parents told me not to get in trouble, not to get in the way, but I got in trouble. I got in good trouble, necessary trouble. Or he would change it, right? And sometimes he would say, but I found a way to get in the way. And it was kind of like he had these different versions. So there wasn't like a unified, simple, crisp phrase to associate. And so I made it a hashtag. I'd first seen it sort of broken down as just Good Trouble. One of the campaign staffers had done it on a poster, and it said, "Getting in good trouble since 1960." And I was like, that's it, right? And so then I just started doing the hashtags over and over again. And then putting it together like the mugshot tweet, right? Like nobody had tweeted it was just so audacious of a congressman to brag about their mugshot, right? John Lewis had never even really done that online and in a congressional capacity. And then you do that, you tell the story, you dramatize it, right? You got to remind people that he was arrested for going to the bathroom, for using a white bathroom. This is a person who's still alive, who's still in front of you, right? And then all of that same sort of work, it's so similar to what you do in a comic book, right? A tweet is just like a comic book panel. It's words and pictures working together. It's sequential narrative, and it is the language of this generation.
That's fantastic. I want to leave room for our Brody scholar, Patrick Kelly, to really dive into the comic book side of your career with you, because he is a major aficionado. So I'm going to steer more into the policy realm for a minute, if you'll pardon me, because I think your role in both the comic book series and in the communications for Congressman Lewis put you in the middle of the currents around civil rights and the modern struggle for civil rights. Could you say a word about what you would consider some of the key areas in the need for civil rights in the current era? Obviously, we're seeing major struggle over voting rights. but that's clearly not the end of the story. Can you say a little bit more about how you, in your lens of having worked with Congressman Lewis and grown up in Atlanta, how you would characterize the major key areas in the public policy sphere for advancing civil rights today?
You know, I was fortunate. I was the only staffer the congressman had who had both a communications and legislative portfolio. So I got to have a foot in both worlds. And we would often give lectures together and push very politely, or the congressman would say very nonviolently, what we saw as the great issues of our time that were the most insidious and holding back what the congressman called the beloved community. And for me, the issue that I spoke most prominently about was student loan debt. When you look at the civil rights movement and you look at it in the context of the anti-war movement, and if you look at it in the context of what happened after sort of the Nixon era, there was a concentrated effort to change American campuses so that they couldn't be occupied. Right. There was an actual architectural movement around that. And then there was the rise of student loan debt, which when you frame it in the context of seeing it as subjugation, I think changes people's perception of what the real motivation is. Doesn't mean you should have free college. Everybody should pitch in. John Lewis worked in a kitchen during college and you know, read about it in March. I mean, he hated scrubbing out the pans because there was on liver night, you know. I mean, that's a rite of passage. But at the same time, the nature of student loan debt was such it really wasn't about providing for the cost of education. The federal government was dialing back their investment in public education. What it was about was subjugation. Because put in the context of John Lewis and his colleagues, what if they had graduated from American Baptist Theological Seminary, as John Lewis did and Bernard Lafayette did and C.T. Vivian did, with crippling student loan debt? John Lewis could not have gone on to take a $10 a week salary as chairman of SNCC, right? Or to put it in another way, when John Lewis got married, the LA Times ran a wedding announcement, and it said, "Unemployed political activist John Lewis to wed Lillian Miles." Right? People who are ahead of their time pay a price, and student loan debt is that thing that's holding back so many people from participating as fully active citizens. And I think it's also holding back our economy. You see it in housing and the way in this generation is actually unable to buy homes. They're unable to move forward, have children, because the debt is so crippling. And it shouldn't be that only people who come from wealthy families can afford to go to receive higher education and then be able to live a life in which they have children and buy a home and live essentially the American dream. And if you look at it, it's divided so strongly along racial lines. It is disproportionately affecting the African-American community, is disproportionately affecting the Latino and the Asian community. It doesn't mean there aren't people of all races and colors suffering from this. But that is the byproduct. It is holding back the building of generational wealth for communities of color all across the country. And it's also stopping our democracy from fully actualizing itself.
So I'm wondering if, you mentioned Congressman Lewis's kind of lifetime commitment to nonviolence, and that he would even talk about it with you as a staff member in terms of how to engage with people. In the first volume of Run, one of the main conflicts within there that you chronicle is the tension in the civil rights movement between the tactics of nonviolence and those of more independence or trending towards violence. Can you say a little bit about what you learned about this tactical debate? Is nonviolence a strategy of the past, or is that a current potential means to some of the ends that you and Congressman Lewis wrote about?
Congressman Lewis and I talked about this quite a bit, and we both saw it the same way. Nonviolence is the only thing that actually does work. If you're an oppressed people and you're outgunned and you're outmatched and you're outspent, finding ways to dramatize the conflict through nonviolent civil disobedience is really the only choice. It's the only effective choice that you have. But what was happening in 1966, as we show and Run, was it was half a decade of pent up aggression of people watching other people being beaten on television night after night, people of color, people who looked like them, and they were frustrated with it. I mean, that's why it's so important and run for us to contextualize the fact that they signed the Voting Rights Act just a week before the Watts uprising happened. You know, I mean, there was so much, there was an emotional and personal toll that so many of the activists paid, even the ones who weren't being beaten themselves, but seeing their colleagues suffer in that way. But John Lewis always believed that nonviolent civil disobedience and the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence was more than a tool or a tactic. It was a way of life. To him, it was a way of living. And I think that comes from how close he was to Reverend Jim Lawson and Dr. King, and that those ministers who held that nonviolence was a part of their faith. And when you look at the divide in SNCC that was happening at that time, these were slightly younger folks who were pushing some of those issues. But I think there was also, like, I could empathize with it. As much as I wholly support John Lewis's position, how can you watch your friends and colleagues be beaten over and over again and not be mad and not want to fight back? But I think that's what makes John Lewis so remarkable, and Jim Lawson and C.T. Vivian and Bernard Lafayette and Diane Nash and so many of these adherents to nonviolence as a way of life, because it does take that special reserve of courage and humility and perseverance to be able to actually live that and suffer those things and emerge without hate, essentially. And I think that's another one of the big questions we're facing right now. How do you watch your friends and colleagues suffer, be beaten and arrested, taken to jail, murdered, having this happen over and over and over again? And yet, when you abandon nonviolence, you give an opening to the other side that allows them to corrupt your mission. Not that you're corrupted, but they corrupt the message that you're bringing, and that crack can be exploited. And that's what allowed John Lewis to be who he was for so long, and then be a force for so many different causes, even after he left the movement.
Well, Andy, I have never met you before today, but I can tell a lot of things about you just from the passion with which you speak about this subject. It's obvious to me that you are much more than just a spokesperson for Congressman Lewis. You imbibed in those discussions and in that many years with him a level of understanding about human beings, about political change. I'm wondering if you could share with our students here on the call any thinking about how you find a career that taps that passion. You've clearly found a way to tap your passion and issues and people and communities you care about. What kind of advice would you give to our students here about their pursuit of a career in this very broken world we're living in today?
I think there's a number of opportunities that I was given by people who simply cared about me, and that, above all else, helped me get to where I wanted to be. So the first thing I would say is mentors. I mean, you have to seek out mentors, people who are willing to invest in you and listen to your ideas and help you grow and change, and understand that the person that you are at 20 or 22 is not the person you will be at 30, 35, 40. And in that capacity, you also have to be mentors to other people. Now at my age, you know, I've got, there are these people who came up with me, who worked for me, and they're doing great, and I'm so proud of them. It's a two-way street. But I think the other thing that gets lost sometimes, especially when you look at it in the context of March and the things where they give you the big trophies and all that other sort of stuff, is that you can't be afraid to be laughed at. I mean, over and over and over again, when I was pushing March and trying to explain it to people and tell them that this was going to be big and that it was important and that John Lewis was doing something that would make a major difference, not just in his life, but in civil rights education all throughout the country, right? Everybody laughed at me. I'll never forget being at the New York Federal Reserve Bank with John Lewis. We'd already had book 2 out, you know, the books were proven, all this sort of stuff. And you know, flattered and deeply honored that they invited me to speak along with the congressman. And I remember saying, you know, we have something called the 9-word problem, and March is fixing it. The 9-word problem is most students graduate from high school only knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and that's it. I said, if we're going to fix that, if we're going to teach this generation about their power and how to be nonviolent and how to organize, we have to make sure that John Lewis's story through March is taught in every school in America. And the room burst out laughing at me. I mean, just full. I mean, like, people were like, oh, that's a good one, kid. 3 months later, the New York City public school system adopted March into their curriculum permanently.
Yeah.
And that curriculum is now being used in states all across the country. And I think about that. If you let yourself be deterred from things that you believe, especially as a young person, you see the world differently. You actually see the future far better than people my age or your age. You have to harness that. And you can't be afraid to have people tell you they think you're wrong, or to mock you even. You have to have courage, because the courage that takes is actually far less than the courage it took for John Lewis to stand up to the people who told him he was wrong, to go to that white bathroom, to sit in at that lunch counter. It's a cycle that happens for every generation, and those who are willing to face that fear and to not be deterred, that is their greatest strength.
Yeah. So I wanted to see if you have any thoughts for us about some current issues that are bedeviling not just this generation of students, but this generation of faculty and deans like me. And that is, as we try to really delve into our racial and racist history and present, we find that even something as academic, I will call it, as critical race theory, has been weaponized in the political realm, and many are already saying that, you know, that's the best explanation for the outcomes in the elections last week. On something as sensitive and fraught as race, how would you think about and advise us to both proceed, but also to communicate about what we're doing when we're trying to dig into systemic injustices and educate about systemic injustices? It just feels very wrong to either give up and say, oh, this has been politicized, we have to back off. At the same time, you know, we're kind of losing the battle publicly. Putting on your communications and your policy hats, any thoughts? How would you advise us to proceed when it comes to both the education side and as it's drawn into politics of critical race theory, or let's just call it how we teach about systemic injustices?
I think you've got to show courage right now, and keep in mind that this is a AstroTurf effort. This is not something that is being driven by people concerned about the education of anyone. This is driven by people who are concerned about the outcome of their political power and how it is waning. And the only way in which they can stop people from understanding what it is that they did is to weaponize that very curriculum. Congressman Lewis and I talked about this often, that we believe there was a deliberate and systematic effort to stop the teaching of the civil rights movement in schools. And this is an extension of that. It was quiet. It was kind of under the table. and now it's coming to the forefront. But that's what happens in these moments of change. This is a last gasp in some ways. And I think there's a lot of scholarship out here that I won't quote because these are experts far smarter than I am in that capacity in the academic way. But I will offer the idea that some of this is also about framing. It's still storytelling, right? And I think about the context in which we put the civil rights movement and many of these time periods. We term them Black history, and that's wrong. It is American history. And we let that division permeate for so long that then that sets the stage for something like this CRT AstroTurf fight. And I think when we look at it as academics, when we look at it as communicators, when we look at it as people just trying to teach people what really happened in our society, we've got to find a way to show that these are, just like you said at the outset of this, when you asked about John Lewis, you asked about the human being. And we've got to, as the congressman would say, we've got to show that these people need to be a little bit more human. They need to understand that what's happening right now has happened many times in our past. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And right now, what we're facing is not something that is driven by anything other than political objectives. And this is an opportunity for educators to show courage and to stand strong. Higher education is a place for great ideas, for debating the improvement of society. And just like one of the Joint Chiefs said in his congressional testimony not too long ago, why would we not read something that helps us understand people who are different from ourselves? This burying your head in the sand idea that we're just going to ignore literature, we're going to ignore points of view, that doesn't help human beings understand themselves better, and it doesn't help people improve the economy even. I mean, where do these great ideas come from? They come from understanding other people. So don't tell me some of these folks that we're free market this, we're free market that, but then you don't want to be in a free marketplace of ideas. That's just hypocritical. So stay strong, have courage, as the guys would say.
I can almost hear his echo when you say that. I can tell you're replaying that in your head. So one thing we can do, we can show courage and we can stand strong and we can teach, march and run. And then if people are going to run against us, they'll be running against comic books. And you know, that could be part of our strategy here. Thank you so much, Andy, for having this conversation with me. I want to turn it over now to Patrick Kelly, our Brody Scholar this year, so he can take you through some questions and answers with our students and everyone on this call. I just want to thank you personally, both for your commitment, the passion that you show, and really the wisdom that you've shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinor. This has been an honor, and I'm just, I look forward to getting a chance to meet you in person. This is, I feel like I've met an old friend now, and I look forward to it.
All right, I'm looking forward to that, Andy. Thank you, and over to you, Patrick.
Awesome, thank you so much, Dinor. No, it's been a fantastic conversation so far, and thank you for coming out to speak with us. I know many of our students are really excited to hear from you, especially these specific questions they have. We have a good number of questions. And if you don't mind, we can jump right in.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Awesome. All right. So one of our first ones from one of our students, Meg, she mentions that creativity is something we don't always foster in public policy. So how do you think we can encourage students to be creative in public policy classrooms so that they might eventually find innovative solutions to policy dilemmas?
Well, I love this question because it allows me to brag on Professor Duke. You know, the classroom environment in a policy stance can go many different ways, and sometimes The professor gives you the opportunity to pursue that creativity and fosters it. And that's what I was grateful for, because she let me take this idea of wanting to write a policy thesis about how a comic book could influence elections and participation in the democratic process. And then through that, we found out that, you know, Dr. King helped edit comics. We found out how they used them to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience of the movement. And I think it really comes down to professors giving you that space, and then you having the courage to voice those ideas. I mean, I'll never forget being nervous that first day when we're all having to tell everybody our idea. And there's that beat where I'm like, well, I want to do my thesis about this comic. You may have never heard of it, but I promise it's important. And like, be willing to put yourself out there. I think creativity is a muscle, and you work on it and you build it, and you have to do it in many different capacities. But the greatest successes happen, not to be a Ghostbusters nerd here, but it's when you cross the streams, right? You take civil rights and comic books, you cross the streams, right? And so when you foster that muscle and you keep practicing and you bring it to everything, I think about my own life, the place where it really came from was my mom. My mom loved to come up with creative ideas. We would spend every weekend working in the yard, and she was always trying to plant new plants or take cuttings from somewhere else and root them in the yard. And it was the South, it was hot, you know, but we did it. And it taught me this discipline of creativity, that it's not just about having the great idea. It's about working on the idea. It's about making the idea better. It's about pruning it. It's about watering it. It's about putting fertilizer on it, right? So you build that muscle, and hopefully you find yourself in an environment with professors and colleagues who are willing to support you. And when they're not, and they're laughing at you, you just keep going right on ahead, because they just don't get it yet.
Oh, those are fantastic analogies, and I wholeheartedly agree. We can always talk up Dr. Duke. I hope this gives some of our students some ideas with their own projects with Dr. Duke. She is very open, and we can see some really creative things coming out of projects with her.
I can't wait to see what you guys come up with.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to the next one we have from one of our students, Miranda. You mentioned that courage is critical in the fight for civil rights. How can we inspire others to not only be passionate about these issues, but also be courageous enough to join us in the fight for equality?
You know, the congressman, his first answer would be that you just got to get out there. You got to just do it. And I think sometimes when he would say that, I would always be like, okay, but I need a little bit more, right? Like, I need a little more specificity.
Yeah.
And I think what I've experienced in my life, and what I've also seen through the history that I've had the opportunity to study, is that people are inspired by the actions of others. I'll give you an example. Think about Andy Young, former ambassador, former congressman, former mayor of Atlanta. He was living in New York when he saw the sit-ins happening on the television. And he said, if those people can get beaten, so if those people can go and sit in and get arrested and go to jail, what am I doing here? Not doing anything. And he moved his family. He went down south. He joined SCLC, and he goes on to have his whole life changed because he was inspired by the actions of others. And I think what the congressman was really trying to say when he would say, you just have to do it, is that you have to use your example to inspire other people. And it's not much more complicated than that. I think in my own life, I think about how March has inspired now all these people going out doing nonfiction graphic novels. There were never nonfiction graphic novels before. There was very, very few. And now all of a sudden it's it's like the fastest growing part of comics, which is the fastest growing part of publishing, all this sort of stuff, because they saw that it could work. They read it starts with the thesis, this idea that you could use a comic to teach people quickly and effectively, right? And then you do it. Then you do your research, you prove the concept in an academic standpoint, in an academic setting, and then you go on and you actually make the book and people read it, people love it, and then they follow your example. And so I think what really comes down to when John Lewis would say, just do it, is that you have to be the inspiration. You have to put yourself out there first, because that will bring people along. But underneath that is that it has to be orderly. It has to be, Congressman would say, it has to be peaceful. It has to be nonviolent. But I think what he really means is you can't just go out there and try. You've got to prepare. Congressmen always say one of the things that made the sit-ins so effective is that they studied before they ever went and mounted a protest. They practiced. They had these nonviolence workshops. They would practice spitting on each other or putting a cigarette out in someone's hair. They would pour hot coffee down someone's back. They practiced so that when they went into the room, they went into the lunch counter, they were prepared. They knew what they were up against and they were ready for it. And I think that's the other piece. It is to have that discipline and that preparation so that when you do make these moves and make these actions, people don't see someone who's disorganized. People don't see someone who's not quite prepared. They see somebody who's got their act together, somebody who's showing them the way, and somebody that they can emulate. And then you'll have what happened just like in the sit-in movement, right? Once you see them sitting in Greensboro, and then you see them sitting in Nashville, and all of a sudden they start springing up all across the South. It is about modeling the best possible outcome for other people to follow.
No, that's perfect. I think we all definitely need to be reminded about that discipline, putting in the work beforehand, and then being that example and taking those risks. No, that's all perfect advice. I do really like this next question. One of my other studies right now is terrorism analysis, along with public policy. So this student asks, in what ways can comics and other artistic mediums work to dismantle white supremacy? So in my studies, we've kind of described these as counter narratives and going after these far right movements.
You know, I think it's about dramatizing the conflict. Sometimes you can see it in unexpected ways when someone does that well. It's like, okay, Pete Buttigieg goes and gives a press conference the other day, and he starts talking about how Robert Moses built the bridges so that they were just a little bit too short for the buses to get under, right? He's dramatizing exactly what the real conflict is. That the institutionalization of racist policies was so pervasive that it even went into affecting the height of bridges, the way in which we built the roads that we drive on. And I think comics are so uniquely positioned to be able to do that because there are so many different ways in which people, as the congressman would say, have been left out and left behind. And finding ways to tell that story. Comics can reach such a broad audience, right? I mean, whether it's digital, whether it's in print, and all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil. And then social media has given us this other opportunity to distribute things on a scale I don't think we've ever seen before, right? For better or for worse in some cases. But you can use your story, your narrative, right, to dramatize this conflict. And it's something I'll repeat over and over again, because that's what the congressman was always saying. That's why Martin Luther King went to Birmingham. It's why he went to Montgomery. He was going and he was mounting these campaigns to dramatize the conflict. And it's like Selma, right? The image of John Lewis and Jose Williams and Amelia Boynton and his colleagues being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by the police because they were trying to march for voting rights. It dramatized the conflict. And then when you look at it in the context of a medium like comics, you can tell so much story and provide so much dramatization of these conflicts and find these facts. It doesn't necessarily have to be a linear narrative. There's so much creativity you can bring to the ways in which you use comics, whether it's abstract comics, sort of like Nick Souzanis is doing out at the University of San Francisco, or it's these specific storytelling that you see from people like Lucy Nisley, who is doing these biographies of, or her memoirs of herself. It's all across the spectrum, but it's all about fundamentally dramatizing the conflict and using that to show people exactly what you mean because I think they've weaponized this idea that like, whoa, that people will feel bad about who they are. And I think that's absurd in some ways, but they've created so much propaganda and so much grassroots drama that they are dramatizing a conflict that doesn't exist. And that puts the responsibility on the young people, on the creatives, to dramatize the true conflict and to use the tools that they have and the mediums that work for this generation.
If you don't mind, I have a follow-up question for it.
No, please.
So to slightly play devil's advocate, how do you balance that depicting these problems accurately along with dramatization? Because sometimes that dramatization, I could imagine, might have a backlash effect amongst that far right or white supremacist community. They might take that and run with it and twist it on itself.
Well, let's be clear. When you say dramatizing, it doesn't mean fictionalizing. It means using reality to demonstrate the absurdity of what's happening. And yeah, it's going to create backlash. I mean, just to use the Selma example, the route was lined with Nazis. I mean, actual neo-Nazis living in the United States with the swastikas and you know, the Klan was around there. It was like all along the route, and they had to like have security, and they had to, I mean, that is the nature of conflict. People will push back, but we're also a democracy. And that means that we don't govern through unanimous consent. We see how that works in the Senate a lot of the time, right? We're a democracy, and you're trying to convince 55, 60% of the country of what you're trying to do. And keep in mind, so many of the great reforms that have happened in this country were lambasted as something that would destroy it. I was on the floor of the House when the Affordable Care Act passed. And I remember walking with the congressman across the street and around the Capitol and seeing all of those people, calling him names, telling him he's going to destroy the country, that no one's going to get health care anymore. We're all going to die. And you know what? That didn't happen. All they were fighting back against is health insurance companies making too much money off of people who couldn't afford it, right? And that's always going to be the case. Medicare passed. They said it's going to bankrupt the country. Social Security. They said it's going to bankrupt the country. Well, guess what? America's still here. So if you want to actually create concrete reforms, you don't have to convince 100% of the Americans. You convince 55, 60%. You get it across the line. And then you allow its success to convince the rest of the country, because it is so funny to me, and it is in some ways sad, but it is such a reflection of this very same problem when you see people saying, get your government hands off my Medicare. And you're like, who do you think runs Medicare? And those are the same people who fought its very implementation at the beginning, at its outset. And so just remember that this is a long struggle. As the congressman would say, it's a struggle of not just a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime. Of many lifetimes. So make your point, convince as many people as you can, get that majority, and the rest will come around.
For sure. No, we always, especially in the public policy realm, we want these quick fixes. We want something like, oh, there's got to be something there that we can, once we implement it, we've solved it. But you know, we definitely need to recognize that some of these things are going to take a long time to fully get the effects.
Right. No, absolutely.
So we can move on to the next question. Samal wanted to know earlier how you mentioned that your mom and the ways that she helped you develop your sense of creativity. And we were curious about in what other ways has your own identity and background impacted your writing?
My mother passed away about 4.5 years ago. She passed away 6 months after all that happened with March and the National Book Award and everything. So she got to see it, right? And so we talked a lot about sort of in the last months of her life, why, you know, I remember I asked her, because my mom, I won a bunch of medals, like actual medals, right? They give you like Flavor Flav like medals, right? And so after I got the second one, my mom was like, well, now you have 2 medals. Can I have one of them? And so I said, of course, Mama, of course. And I gave her the medal. And then I came back to visit her for her birthday. And there she was in the front yard, pulling weeds with the medal on. And I asked people around town, I was like, has Mama been wearing that out? And they're like, dude, she wears it to the grocery store. And I remember just thinking like how much that meant to her. So I asked her, and I said, Mama, when I was a kid, everything was so hard because my father left when I was 3, and we really were poor, and we were just struggling to get by. Mama would say we were 99-cent Whopper poor because the only time we got to go out to eat was when Whoppers were on sale for 99 cents. And I asked her, I said, did you ever think that this would, maybe not the National Book Award, maybe not, all these other American Library Association awards, everything else, but do you ever think I'd do anything like this big? And my mom said, I love you with all my heart, son, but no. And I thought about that, the ability to surpass my mother's wildest dreams before she passed. That's luck. That's the greatest gift I could ever, that's the greatest success I could ever hope to have, right? And so as I've been processing my mother's passing in the years since, it has made me reflect quite a bit on the ways in which she influenced my creativity. And it was from the very outset. Mama always had me reading. She was the kind of woman who went to the library and, didn't just have her library card. She had a library card for me. She had a library. I mean, if she could have had a library card for the dog, she would have, right? And then she would use each one of them to reserve as many books as she possibly could. She would go through the New York Times bestseller list. She would go through all the she would read about the awards and whatnot, and so there was always a stack of books by her bed, and she would always be egging me on to read them. And sometimes, honestly, she would tell me about like the salacious bits. I remember being like 12 years old, and my mom, saying, well, there's kind of a racy scene in there, and like 12, 13-year-old me is like, ooh, and then I remember she also took a lot of risks. She let me sort of pursue my passions in ways that other parents might have thought was a little nuts. I got to go to Dragon Con, the big Atlanta comic book convention, when I was 12 years old by myself. I had one of those big cell phones. Like, she made me wear a fanny pack with let me just tell you how cool I was. But no, I had and she let me, I was only allowed to go during the day because they got a little rowdy at night, all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to do it. And she let me do that in a way that made me independent and self-reliant. But if I'm totally honest, probably the hardest part of all of it was when I was a teenager. Because, like we talked about earlier, creativity is a muscle that you have to build. And the success really comes from the discipline and the self-reliance and the self-motivation. And I remember my mother and I really having a tough time when I was in high school because she wanted me to be independent, and so she wouldn't help. I mean, she just stopped. It was the only way she knew how. I got an after-school job. I worked at a toy store, FAO Schwartz, if you remember that place. And that meant I wasn't gonna be able to mow the grass, but that was my responsibility. So rather than my mother paying to have a yard man or get somebody else to help, she said, all right, well, you figure it out. So I ended up going and hiring one of the guys that was working on somebody else's yard, so that because I would make more money working at that job than I would than it cost me to have someone mow the grass. And I was completely independent at that point. We were so independent. I had my own fridge in my own room where I kept my own food. And at the time, I thought she was really mean. I thought she was just being the biggest jerk. Like, why? I'm looking at all my other friends, their parents are paying for everything. They're helping them with homework. They pay their, they got their own cars, like all this sort of stuff. But then when I graduated from college, and you have that first month, 2 months, 6 months, where you are completely on your own, not in a dorm, not anywhere. You don't know if you're gonna, how, you know, you're gonna have a job, like what's gonna happen. And I remember watching one by one so many of those friends whose parents did so much for them. I watched them struggle. Meanwhile, within 24 months of graduating, I was working for John Lewis. Within 36 months of graduating, I had the idea for March. Within 48 months of graduating, I was in grad school at Georgetown. And that meanness that I thought she was directing towards me was actually kindness. It was the greatest gift she could give me, which is the ability to care for myself and to have the discipline and the ability to make it on my own. And she gave it to me at a time when I knew it hurt her to do that. She and I were so close my whole life. So to separate like that, it was incredibly difficult. And then when my mother died, I really became quite a mess. And then to lose the congressman too, I realized she was also preparing me for that. That she knew someday I would be completely on my own. And I would have to stand up and make a life for myself without being able to call and ask for advice, without being able to lean on her. And I've done okay. But now that I know how hard that is, I know that what she did in those years when I thought she was being such a jerk was a gift and a way for her to continue to care for me, even after she's gone.
No, it's definitely
Sorry, man,
those.
that got heavy.
No, it's those things that we definitely don't understand in the moment, and then years later we start to appreciate it. No, I'm very sorry for your loss, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to make sure that we are cognizant of your time. Don't want to be going too far over. But if you happen to have any parting words with the students in the audience we have here today, you've imparted so much knowledge and insight, and I'm sure we're all very, very appreciative. But if there's anything else, please share.
I think the most important thing to remember at this point in your life is how free you are. You're more free than any of us. I know it's hard. I know sometimes it feels like there's never enough money, there's never enough time, that the world seems like this amazing place with a piece of glass in between you and it, and you don't know how to get through it. But remember, you live in a part of your life in which you get to choose your path. And any path you choose is going to be difficult. So don't let its difficulty scare you away. But remember how lucky you are to get to choose, to be in a school like you're in, to have all these professors who are rooting for you, who want you to choose the path that makes you genuinely happy. I hear people talk to me a lot about, seems like you followed your passion. And yeah, that's exactly what I did. And when I made decisions based on that, and not some cold calculating, oh, I'll get money, oh, I'll get a prestigious this, oh, I'll get that, those were the best decisions. And those were decisions that were only possible because I was young and because I was free. So remember that and use it, because the time will go really fast, far faster than you think. And we need you. This country needs you. We need y'all to make brilliant new things, to come up with incredible new ideas. It's what built this country, and that's what's going to save this country. So thank you for giving me a little time to express myself to you. It feels good, and I wish I could be with all of you in person. I hope maybe we can do that again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, this has been a fantastic time. I know I got a lot out of it. I'm sure many, many others did, and we would be absolutely thrilled to have you back again.
Awesome. I'm gonna
But
hold
yes,
you to
and,
that, Patrick.
yes, definitely. And I wanted to make sure to thank Dean Orr for moderating our discussion. If you have anything to say, please do.
I just wanted to thank Andy again, and folks, it just shows you wisdom does not come with years, it comes with experience. So take his advice, get out there, do it up, and then we can have you all back to have this talk in a little bit. But Andy, thank you for inspiring us all, old as
thank you so
well as
much,
young.
Dane.
Look
Thank
forward to
so
having
much.
you in person.
Can't wait. You just give me a time.
Well, I appreciate everybody on the Zoom today joining us. We do hope to have more of these seminars later on in the year and next year. So please stay tuned, and thank you. And take care, everybody.